So I've logged 50 authoritarian-like actions since the 1st of December, and in part 1 I covered the populist nationalism agenda, but that's not all that's been going on. So now in part 2 I'm also going to explain what's been happening in health policy and civil rights. So let's start with vaccinations. You may have seen some headlines about the hepatitis B vaccination, but let's kind of dig into actually what's happened this week. Firstly, just to set the scene, the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, convenes what's called the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, or ACIP. And that basically advises the US government on what vaccines should be given to Americans and when. And that includes the kind of routine vaccinations that people get during childhood. So over the summer, the Health Secretary, RFK Jr., he sacked all the members of ACIP and replaced them with his own picks, including the new chair, Kirk Mahone, who's a known critic of the COVID vaccine. So ACIP met last week specifically to discuss the children's vaccine schedule. Now, before the meeting, the chair had already said that the panel planned to vote to end the universal hepatitis B vaccination recommendation at birth. So at the moment, the recommendation is that all newborns should get the hepatitis B vaccination within 24 hours of being born. And he also said that the panel wanted to assess whether childhood immunizations are linked to allergies and autoimmune disorders. So basically also trying to create some doubt over the safety and efficacy of the routine vaccines. Now, when the panel actually met last week, it included a really long presentation, so over an hour, which is a really long time to give a presentation, by prominent anti-vaxxer and ally of RFK Jr., a man called Aaron Siri. So during that presentation, he advocated for a complete rethink of the US childhood vaccine schedule. So who is he, right? Well, he's not a doctor. He doesn't have a medical background. Aaron Siri is a lawyer, and his business really involves taking vaccine companies to court. And his inclusion as an expert presenter in the panel was denounced by health experts and included Republican Senator Bill Cassidy, who is a qualified doctor. So the upshot is that sure enough, the panel then voted to end the CDC recommendation that newborns should receive the hepatitis B vaccination. Now, this vaccine has been used safely for years and is estimated to prevent thousands of cases of hepatitis B in infants a year and hundreds of deaths. And independent medical bodies like the American Academy of Pediatrics is still strongly recommending that all newborns receive the vaccine within 24 hours of birth. Separately, the CDC may recommend vaccines, but it's a different body that actually licenses them, and that's the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA. And last week, there was a new appointee to the FDA Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, and that is a woman called Tracy Hogue. Now, she is the 5th director this year for that agency, but she is also extremely controversial COVID vaccine skeptic. And in fact, she was the one who did the analysis that I covered last week, where they basically linked the COVID vaccine to 10 children's deaths using a very inappropriate methodology. And then the same day that they appointed Tracy Hogue, a dozen former leaders of the FDA criticised the Trump administration over its changes to vaccine policy and basically called it a threat to public safety. And they did this in an article published in the top medical journal, the New England Journal of Medicine. So that is kind of explaining a little bit about the continued attacks on vaccination and childhood vaccinations that are happening in the US. So the next kind of attack on science that I want to cover is fuel economy. Now, bear with me. I know that might seem extremely boring, but it really does affect every American who drives a petrol car, right? So what happened is that last week, President Trump proposed cutting the fuel economy standards that Biden had actually put in last year in 2024. And what Trump wants to do is make it easier for car makers to sell gasoline-powered cars as part of his, Unleash American Energy program. This is what it breaks down as, right? So Biden had mandated that cars have to get to 50 miles a gallon by 2031. But now the Trump administration, under the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, so not something that kind of trips off the tongue, but they're saying that car makers only need to get to 34 miles per gallon by 2031. And what that does is it does make cars a bit cheaper, but it will ultimately cost Americans a lot more in fuel because they'll need to buy more fuel to travel the same distance, right? And so Trump's own administration have estimated the impact of this change. And they've said that, okay, well, upfront vehicle costs would be almost $1,000 cheaper. So it will cost you less to buy a car. But fuel costs on average will go up by about £800 a year. So over the lifetime of the car, it's going to be much more expensive. And the move also means, because of increased fuel consumption, that carbon emissions will go up by about 5%. However, and this may give you some hint as to why the administration is pursuing it, this move is estimated to save car makers billions of dollars, because they just don't have to spend the money making their cars more fuel efficient. So there's actually been quite a lot happening this week in the whole kind of area of civil rights. So the first thing is that the US Attorney General, Pam Bondi, ordered federal law enforcement to step up investigations into anti-fascist or Antifa movements and what she called similar extremist groups. And what she did is she asked the FBI to compile a list of entities that might be engaged in domestic terrorism. And what she specifically wanted them to do is to start targeting those entities for tax crimes. Now, she hasn't specified who these other groups are. Antifa itself is not an organization. And tax prosecution has been a really common way for the US government to target dissent. So, for instance, Martin Luther King was targeted with prosecution over income tax back in the 1960s. And so the worry is with this is that the administration is basically just going to brand organizations that oppose it as domestic terrorists and start targeting them for investigations. The other thing that's happened is that since 2003, this is a long time ago, in 2003, the Prison Rape Elimination Act passed unanimously in Congress. It was a bipartisan act. And what it did is it required people in prison to be screened for their risk of facing sexual assault. And that includes rape. And specifically, they said that that assessment had to determine or had to take into account their risk if they were LGBT plus, right? Because it was already known that people who were LGBTQ plus were more at risk of sexual violence in prison. And what it meant is that if you were considered to be more at risk, that had to be taken into account in terms of where and how you were incarcerated. So this is a long-standing legislation, but last week, the Department of Justice issued a memo that said that the state should explicitly ignore LGBTQ plus considerations when they audit whether prisons are complying with the law. So effectively, it significantly weakens the obligations of prisons to protect their LGBTQ plus inmates from sexual assault, which to me just seems pretty horrific and regressive. And then the last thing here is something which I think is incredibly petty and mean. Admiral Rachel Levine served as the Assistant Secretary of Health under Biden, and she was in charge of the Commission Corps of the US Public Health Service. And she was the first transgender person to win Senate confirmation. And her portrait has been displayed in the Department of Health and Human Services building since 2021. So this week, the department has changed the name in her official portrait to her previous male name. So what is commonly called dead naming someone. There's no reason to do that, right? But they just did it to, I have to assume, to humiliate her. So that is the last thing that happened in terms of civil rights. So the last thing that happened are various ways in which it's become very clear that Trump wants to be treated as a king. So the first thing, like populist leaders, they love to celebrate themselves. And so last week, the National Park Service announced some changes to how it, or why it would offer free entry to its national parks, right? So the first thing it did is it said it would stop offering free entry on Martin Luther King Jr. Day and Juneteenth. So Juneteenth is the 19th of June, and it celebrates the end of slavery in the US. But it added a new free entry day to its calendar, and that day is Donald Trump's birthday. The second thing is that Donald Trump's name has been added to the sign outside the United States Institute of Peace in Washington, D.C. It was called the U.S. Institute of Peace, and now it's called the Donald J. Trump Institute of Peace. And the White House spokesperson said, "This is both beautifully and aptly named after a president who has ended 8 wars in less than a year." The last thing is that you may know that Trump did not win the Nobel Peace Prize this year. Mr. Infantino, who is president of FIFA, so soccer's global governing body, kind of quite prominently campaigned for Donald Trump to get the Nobel Peace Prize. It's also true that the next Soccer World Cup is going to be held in the United States. So what happened was that FIFA has decided to institute its own peace prize called Football Unites the World. It was very hastily arranged. It surprised several of the body's most senior officials, including its board members. So to the surprise of absolutely no one, Trump was awarded the inaugural prize last week along with a gold medal, and FIFA has not disclosed its selection process. So I think, we saw a slightly quieter October and November in the US, maybe because of the shutdown or the preoccupation with the Epstein files. But it really feels like in December that things are starting to really accelerate again. So there's just been a lot to cover this week. See you next week. So if you enjoyed this video, then you might also enjoy this video, which was about some other actions that you may have missed of the Trump administration.